Right. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight for this webinar on Scottish literature in translation. Before we start talking about that, I'd like to introduce very briefly the project. It's a project which was set up by our three universities, so Lausanne, Glasgow, and Aix-en-Provence, because our universities are part of a European alliance of 11 universities, which is called the CIVIS Alliance. And within that alliance, we created this project of a seminar on contemporary Scottish literature, which we entitled "What Past Have We Now?" And we're now in the third. In the second, anticipating, we're now in the second year of this project. We meet twice a year. We have an autumn seminar and a spring seminar with a theme each year. The first year, for the first year, the theme was the political horizon of devolution. This year, 2025-2026, we have chosen to speak about what we call the outreach of Scottish literature. And our first webinar took place in autumn on poetry and public life in Scotland. It was hosted virtually by the University of Lausanne. And today we'll be talking with our two speakers about Scottish literature in translation. In the third year, we're planning to organize a conference in person at Aix-Marseille University. And one last word on our alliance. This alliance is both a research and teaching alliance. So we'll be thinking about how we want the project to move forward. So just about the seminars that we've already held. If you've missed them or you're interested in any of them, or if you want to watch any of them again, they're available on YouTube. So easy enough to get hold of them if you Google CIVIS seminar, maybe Lerma and Scottish literature, you can't miss it. So as I said, today we'll be talking about Scottish literature in translation with our two speakers, John Corbett and Paul Barnaby. And before I introduce them, I just want to, make a few housekeeping announcements as usual. This is a webinar. Could you please turn off your microphones while you're not speaking? And you can ask. We'll be listening to the two talks. We'll listen first, and then we can ask all the questions that we want at the end. You can ask your questions as we go along in the chat, or if you prefer, you can wait till the end and raise your virtual hands to ask your question live. So I would like now to hand over to our first speaker, John Corbett, who's a professor of English at Beijing Normal Hong Kong Baptist, trying to get this right, University. And John's publications are too many to be quoted. So I just selected two, John, that were particularly relevant to today's talk and to the topic for today. In 2025, John co-edited with Li a book entitled Scotland in China, Literary Encounters. And thank you. And 2024, with Li Defeng, there's the Routledge Handbook of Corpus Translation Studies. So today, John will be talking to us about Scottish literature in and out of translation, as he put it, or as others see us. If you want to share your screen, John, then the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, that's great. I'll start then. Well, first of all, thank you for coming. Thanks to Marie, Kirsten, and Corey, and everybody at CIVIS for the invitation to give the webinar in association, I understand, with the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literature too. And thank you all too for tuning in either live today or later to the recording. My topic is translation into and out of Scottish literature, and that is a huge topic for 20 minutes. And I'll spend most of it just raising questions and giving illustrations that might suggest not answers necessarily, but directions towards answers. I'll try to spend about 15 minutes looking at translation into Scottish literature, mainly trying to answer the question, why do it? And maybe another 5 minutes looking at the translation of Scottish literature into other languages, mainly Chinese, because that's what I've been looking at lately. Paul will then eloquently talk about the latter in more detail, I imagine, in relation to the bibliography of Scottish literature and translation, BOSLIT. So I'll be asking whether translation opens a window to Scottish culture or whether it is in fact a mirror of the translating culture. So I'll begin with questions about translation into Scottish literature from other languages and literary cultures. And the fundamental question I'll be asking is why? Various factors prompt the why question. There is the nationalist factor. Scottish literature, unlike English literature, is defined in terms of national identity rather than, say, linguistically. English literature can be defined as literature in English or even literature in different kinds of English, not just English, but American English, Irish English, Scottish English, Indian, Australian, New Zealand, Cameroonian, South African English, and so on. Now, Scottish literature isn't like that. Scottish literature is multilingual. It's got English, Scots, and Gaelic at the very least, and it's defined on a national basis. Literatures from other countries are alien to that national identity. Scottish literature is defined to a certain extent against other literatures. So the project of translating the literatures of other countries into Scottish literature is, by its very virtue, suspect. Readers of Scottish literature want, to quote, "nae cotillon brent new frae France, but hornpipes, jigs, strathspeys and reels," as Robert Burns puts it in Tam O'Shanter, or elsewhere in Burns's oeuvre, who would wish to dine on ragout, olio, or fricassee when you could sit down to a haggis? So Scottish literature should be Scottish. Another factor that prompts the question why lay behind a question that I was actually asked by a fellow attendant at the first conference I went to on translation studies at Warwick University back in the mid-1990s, before most of you were born, when I gave one of my first faltering papers on literary translation into Scots. Why, I was asked, would anyone wish to translate literature into Scots, a language nobody understands? And I've been worrying about that question now for about 30 years, and it's not a bad question. It's not a bad question because Scottish literature is a minority literature. Whoops, said Daisy, sorry. I'm going to escape from that and share the other screen. I've given you the wrong PowerPoint slide.
Oh, okay.
Let me escape. Let me escape from that. Escape. And stop sharing
Sounds like a
screen.
good talk. Maybe you could do it afterwards.
Yeah. Right, I've stopped sharing that screen. I did a rehearsal where I actually inserted my own voice, but I'll try to get the other one now. I'll share the screen. And I just, let me see now. Okay. Now there should be a version of this. No, that's the wrong one.
It's coming on. It's coming on.
Let me just, I apologize for that, just as I was getting into mid-flow. Let me see. Just give me a second.
That's fine.
I have found it, but I realise that I need to delete myself, which will take me 30 seconds.
There's one with the voiceover as well that you recorded before.
Yeah,
So that's not the one that you want to show us, unless you want to go and have a cup of coffee and, give us the one with voiceover.
Not at all. Give me just 2 seconds and I've got it.
That's fine. While Joan is looking for, the right PowerPoint presentation, can I just add something which I forgot because I'm seeing Natalie here, the other thing, this webinar is for our project on Scottish literature, but also I belong at my university in Aix-Marseille University. I belong to a research group that is called Histoire et vie des littératures, and in this group we study the circulation of literatures, in a variety of ways, not just, of course, the Scottish literature because I'm the only Scottish literature specialist, but we look at the circulation of literature. So the seminar is also part of our project with the HVL. So, the people who are with me, work with me in this group are also part of the interested in what you have to say about it, because it's also one of the, that's the one. It's also one of the elements that we work on in the group that I work with at my university.
Okay, so
thank you for giving me time to say this, John.
No, thank you for giving me time to find the right PowerPoint slide. Okay, as I was saying, I want to take a look first of all at the question why translation, why translate into particularly Scots and Gaelic. The question that I was asked at the conference in Warwick was why translate into languages, particularly minority languages that nobody understands. So Scottish literature is a multilingual literature. It's in Scots, Gaelic, and English. It's composed in 2 minority languages, Scots and Gaelic, and a majority language, English. There are other languages of Scottish literature, Latin, French, and Esperanto, to name a few, but I want to focus today on English, Scots, and Gaelic. Now, the reasons why for translating into Scottish, Scots, and Gaelic are different from translating into English. As far as the minority languages, Scots and Gaelic, are concerned, we can identify a number of common reasons, and these will be shared with translations into other minority languages and other literary cultures, I'd imagine. So what I want to do for the next 10 minutes or so is just summarize 8 reasons why. 8 reasons why to translate into the minority languages, mainly the minority languages of Scots and Gaelic. So this is the first reason. The status of the minority language in literature is raised by association with canonical world classics. And that's a constant throughout the continuous history of Scottish literature, the attempt by some writers to ally the homely minority tradition, the homely minority Scottish language and Scottish literary tradition to the international canon of great literature. So in the 16th century, Gavin Douglas famously translates Virgil's Aeneid specifically to show that Scottish literature can do it. He says this in his prefaces. Not in those words, but that's basically the idea, that Scottish literature is capable of absorbing these international canonical classics. And since the 16th century, one of the driving forces for writers in Scots, and to a lesser extent in Gaelic, has been to affirm the status of the minority language and minority literatures by importing great works. You find it with Douglas and Virgil, you find it with Alan Ramsay and Robert Ferguson doing versions of Horace in the 18th century. You find different versions of the Bible from the 19th century onwards in Scots, leading up to William Lorimer's magisterial New Testament in the 1980s. So the minority literature and the minority languages are enhanced by association with globally recognized canonical literatures. Now, the second reason, the second reason is that there's an attempt to signal a commonality in theme or experience between the source and the target culture, whether majority or minority. So translation into Scottish literature and translation into Scots and Gaelic takes place because the experience of being in one culture is seen as being akin to being in another culture. So, for example, as I said, Ramsay and Ferguson translate from Horace not just because it's a canonical Latin classic, but in part because they're attracted to Horace's poetry because the Roman poet rejected metropolitan corruption in favour of provincial pleasures. Horace's Villa near Licenza in Italy becomes a projection of Edinburgh. The Sabian Hills become the Pentlands in Scotland. London may be the present-day imperial capital, but Edinburgh is the Athens of the North. So translation gives us a frame to understand our own experience and to a certain extent ennoble our own experience. We're like this other culture in some respects. We're not the centre. Horace is writing from outside Rome. Ramsay and Ferguson are writing from outside London. But Edinburgh has worth in the same way that Horace's Villa in Licenza has worth. The third reason why is perhaps the most enjoyable. There is an attempt to reappropriate via translation a text that should have been Scottish. So these are texts that are written in other languages, other cultures, but they should have been Scottish. And the most obvious translation that addresses this motive are the various versions of Shakespeare's Scottish play. They have been published, they've been staged. There are translations of a single speech from Macbeth by Edwin Morgan and translations of the whole play by Robert Lorimer and David Purvis. So that's the third reason why. The fourth reason why is that there's an attempt to plug the gaps in the history and tradition of Scottish literature by translating texts that, for whatever reason, do not have Scottish counterparts. And maybe they shouldn't have been Scottish, but Scottish literature hasn't got these texts, and these texts are important. So, by plugging the gaps, we make the Scottish literary tradition fuller and different. I've already mentioned the New Testament in Scots by William Lorimer. The idea behind this is that the Bible, if there had been an authorised Scots Bible in the 16th or 17th century, perhaps there wouldn't have been the language shift towards English that we find taking place. Maybe Scots would still be a full national language. One of the things that I've been interested in is the explosion of translations, drama translations in Scotland from the 1940s onwards. There are translations particularly of Molière, the Mac-Molières, but also Goldoni. And the idea behind this is that Scotland lacked, in the popular imagination, Scotland lacked a drama tradition in the earlier period. And so we take the Scottish literature fuller by translating those plays into Scots. And we also ask what would have happened if the professional production of plays in Scotland had not been banned post-Reformation by the Scottish Church or Kirk. The fifth of the 8 reasons why is that there's an attempt to forge a cultural alliance across minority languages and cultures. And one minority language and culture is the Québécois culture of Canada and the Scottish culture of Scotland. So we find the plays of Québécois writer Michel Tremblay being translated into Scots. Now, these possibly do not yet rank as canonical world literature, but they were enormously successful on stage in Scots translation by Bill Findlay and Martin Bowman. And we can argue that the situation vis-a-vis Canada and Quebec can be projected onto the UK and Scotland. So you've got Quebec and Scotland form a cultural alliance. A more recent, but I think a complicated and problematical translation that tries to do this is the translations, the poetic translations of contemporary Chinese poet Jeudi Ma Jia. These have been translated into Scots by Sheena Blackhall, Christine De Luca, and Stuart Patterson, Northeast Scots, Shetlandic Scots, and West Central Scots. As the introduction by Jerry Luce, the late editor, suggests, the aspiration here is to align, minority Yi culture in China, the Yi minority, with Scotland. But this is a complicated cultural alliance, not least because Jeudi Majia publishes in Mandarin Chinese, and the concept of ethnicity and dialect in China is very different from the concept of ethnicity and dialect in the West. So it's problematical. It's still a fascinating set of translations, but it suggests that the cultural alignments indicated by the act of translation should be subject to critical examination. The sixth reason why to translate into Scots is that there's an interest in teaching Scots or teaching Gaelic to readers, not least to readers in Scotland. So in a way of recovering the language, a way of transmitting the language across generations, is to take a popular source text, not necessarily a canonical source text, but a popular source text, and use people's familiarity with that popular text to teach readers Scots. So, for example, the Ichiku series of braw books for bairns, not all of which are translations by any means, the translations use children's knowledge of and love of the work of Roald Dahl, J.K. Rowling, A.A. Milne, Hergé, and so on, to attract readers to the Scots language texts and increase their confidence in reading Scots. And a lot of these translations, as you can see, are aimed at children. The penultimate reason for translating into Scottish literature, not necessarily into Scots, but it includes Scots, is that there's an interest in innovating the poetics of Scottish literature by adapting the poetics of the source culture. And this is a formal issue. Part of Edwin Morgan's interest in translating the concrete poetry of the Brazilian brothers Augusto and Haroldo de Campos was in their formal innovations. On the screen, you can see a brief example of how that bleeds into Morgan's own poetry. On the left of the screen, you can see a poem by Augusto de Campos, Uma Vez, and Edwin Morgan translates this as once was. In the original poem on the far left, Augusto de Campos tells an oblique and mysterious narrative about a killing, possibly a political assassination, possibly a crime of passion. There's a bullet, a case, a ditch. And he tells this story through a succession of noun phrases, indefinite article and noun, uma plus noun, uma plus noun. Morgan's translation doesn't quite achieve that syntactic focus. He changes the grammar. He tries to keep the sound of the original, but he changes the grammar. So uma vez, once upon a time, or one time, becomes once was. So in his translation, he doesn't quite get the formal simplicity of the original, but he does it in his own poem, his own original poem, Space Poem 3, Of Course, which does a very similar thing to Uma Vez. It tells an oblique narrative through a series of noun phrases, this time with definite article, not indefinite article, plus nouns, and the nouns are repeated in an increasingly sinister fashion. Now, it seems obvious to me, at least, that Morgan was learning technique from the concrete poets through the act of translation. For Scots, a similar thing can be seen in Brian Holton's translations of formal classical poetry. He can't mimic, he can't mimic the tonal variations of the Chinese originals, but he does experiment with the placement of the caesura in the Scots poetic line, placing it in unusual ways systematically, and sometimes even voicing the caesura with a discourse marker. And this gives the listener or the reader a sense that something formal is structuring the verse. And through the pressure of the Chinese, through the act of translation, new variations on Scots metre are created. So the act of translation can change the poetics of the receiving language. Finally, the translator is just interested in the source text and writer. Edwin Morgan acknowledges this in his own essay on translation, The Third Tiger. The translation of poetry, he says, tends to begin when the translator comes across some foreign poetry that interests and excites him, and he wants to convey, to bring across, to translate that interest and excitement for people using his own language. Morgan then goes on to complicate that apparently simple statement: we can't exclude personal interest or preference in a source text or writer from these reasons. Now, these 8 different motivations can obviously overlap and combine, and they're mainly, but not exclusively, applied to translations into Scots and to a lesser extent, Gaelic. Okay, if I have 4 minutes left, I will turn to other issues. First of all, I'd like to talk about uncanonical translations. I would argue that translations into the minority languages, Scots and Gaelic, tend to be fairly visible if you're taking a look at the Scottish literary tradition. Translations into the majority language, into English, can be invisible as Scottish literature. Now, my Penguin classic, which is on screen, my Penguin classic of the marvellous novella by Machado de Assis, the Brazilian writer, his version of Othello, Dom Cosmuro, was translated rather unreliably by a Scot, Robert Scott Buccleuch. But I don't think many people will have heard of Robert Scott Buccleuch, and you probably don't find him on curricula of Scottish literature. To be part of the canon, you need to have established your own reputation, like Willa and Edwin Muir or Edwin Morgan. Even then, you might find the poems of Edwin Muir and Edwin Morgan, or the novels of William Muir, Scottish literature, but you don't find their English language translations. Even the extremely accomplished English language drama translations of Robert David MacDonald, devised for the Citizens Theatre in the 1970s and 80s, tend to be relatively invisible alongside the Scots translations of Liz Lochhead, Edwin Morgan, Bowman, and Findlay. So, one moral, perhaps, would be that if you want to be recognised as a Scottish translator, don't write in English. I want to finish off by looking at translations into Chinese from Scottish literature. I've already talked about recent translations of Jeudi Maja's poetry into Scots. He's also translated into Portuguese, and the Portuguese translation begins with the assertion by the translator, José Luís Peixoto, este livro é uma janela. This book is a window. Now, this is complete nonsense. And to his credit, José Luís Peixoto kind of undermines his own assertion during the course of his introduction. He talks about ways in which translations are not necessarily windows, but the opening bold rhetorical statement is that a translation will give you a transparent access to the source culture. And I'm going to argue for about 3 minutes that this is not the case. First of all, I want to take a look at the case of Robert Burns in China. This is from the book Scotland and China that I co-edited with Daisy Lee. The clock is saying my time is up, but if you give me 2 more minutes.
Yes, we do.
That's great. I want to take a look at 2 case studies very, very briefly. Robert Burns in China. First of all, Burns in China. Burns is translated in the early part of the 20th century as a love poet. Red, Red Rose is translated and translated again and again. Then in the 1940s, with the Civil War and the rise of the People's Republic of China at the end of the 1940s and into the 1950s, Burns becomes a socialist poet. He becomes a socialist poet to the extent that lines of Burns's poetry in Chinese are used in propaganda posters in China. Dr. Li Suping's chapter tells us this. And so, because of the political situation in China, it is the political aspect of Burns, his proto-socialism, his radicalism, and also his status as a minority poet, a bit like Jeudi Maja. These are coming to the fore. Then there's the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. There is no more translation. When Burns reappears in the 1970s, it's again as a love poet, a love lyricist. Red, Red Rose comes back to the fore. So one of the things that Li Suping observes is that Burns's reputation and Burns's status through translation in China is not shaped by his Scottishness. And it's not shaped by Western academia's reception of Burns. It's shaped by the political and social situation in China. The aspects of Burns that make him interesting are taken and then reused to fit the Chinese circumstances. So translation is a mirror of Chinese society, not a window into Scottish society. You can contrast this with the reception of Ivanhoe in China. Chu Kangyan, in a recent prize-winning chapter, talks about Ivanhoe in Taiwan. My Taiwanese friend says, Taiwan is not China. But Ivanhoe is translated and published in Taiwan in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And it's translated by someone called La Yili. And then there is the film version, the Hollywood film version, which released in 1952. So the novel is popular and the film version is very, very popular. The problem with this is that Lai Yili does not exist. Lai Yili is a figment. Ivanhoe in Taiwan was translated by two mainland Chinese translators. And then the Taiwanese publishing house either pirated this or kept their contribution secret because it was not allowed at the time, it was not permitted by the Taiwanese military government to work with mainland Chinese translators. The story of Ivanhoe, which is Saxons versus French, which in Scotland it becomes Scots versus English, is read in Taiwan as Taiwanese versus Chinese. And in the movie poster on the right, you have anti-communist slogans around the main Chinese poster. So the simple point that I'm making is that Burns in China is pro-communist. Ivanhoe in Taiwan is anti-communist. So the translations basically are a mirror and not a window. My final word then is that I began thinking about this by accident 30 years ago when I was invited by Susan Bassanet to write an article that eventually expanded into this book written in the language of the Scottish nation. I didn't think that my own interest would outlast that original article, but the article became a book, and that has become a lifelong interest, which is always developing and always extending into the peculiarities and the complications of translation into and out of Scottish literature. And I hope that you will also begin exploring the topic. So thank you very much for listening, and I apologize for the break.
That's fine. Thank you very much, John, for this very, very interesting presentation. Without further ado, we need to move on so that we can give Paul time to speak as well. So just a few words to introduce Paul. Paul is a modern literary collections curator at the University of Edinburgh. He has published on translation and also more generally on the reception of Scottish writing broadly. He's one of the pioneers of a very important project on translation of Scottish literature, which is the BOSLIT project, which you're going to talk about today, Paul. And I just want to mention as well that Paul has written an extended chapter in a book that was published in France entitled La Nouvelle Alliance, which was about the translation of Scottish writing into French, published in 2001, if my memory serves me right. So a very interesting presentation of that topic for those of you who might be interested. And today, Paul will be going back over this period about the birth of BOSLIT, and you entitled your talk "Setting Up a Database of Scottish Literature in Translation." So if you want to share your screen, Paul, we'll be ready for you.
I'm trying to. Yeah, is that all right? Can you? Am I sharing that?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. Let's say I'm just going to talk about the early years of the BOSLIT project, basically from 1994 to 1999, but I will be bringing the whole project up to date at the end of my talk, I hope. I'll just set my stopwatch. Yes, so the project, a project to create an online searchable bibliography of translations of Scottish writing, emerged from discussions in 1993 to 4 between representatives of the Scottish Arts Council, the Scottish Poetry Library, Edinburgh University, Heriot-Watt University, and the National Library of Scotland, henceforth NLS. Now, these discussions took place against the background of several converging currents. Firstly, there's the upsurge in literary and cultural activity in Scotland following the failure of the 1979 referendum on devolution. Publication in 1981 of Alistair Gray's novel Lanark is widely hailed as the beginning of a new era. Secondly, there's a concomitant movement, particularly gathering pace in the 1980s, to establish Scottish literature as a distinct entity and a discrete academic discipline. Thirdly, there's the growth of translation studies in this period, coinciding with growing interest in cross-disciplinary and international cooperation. And finally, the burgeoning of information technology, particularly the rise of the World Wide Web, opening up previously unimaginable horizons for research. So the creation of a tool that would enable people to explore the international reach of Scottish writing obviously fitted this zeitgeist. And it was hoped that a bibliography of Scottish literature in translation might serve a number of purposes. First, it would present scholars of Scottish literature and of translation and reception studies with a reliable record of what had or had not been translated. It would point foreign readers with an interest in Scottish writing or in a particular Scottish writer to translations in their own language. And it would tell translators themselves which works or writers hadn't been translated. It would alert the National Library of Scotland to translations missing from its collections. And it would point the Scottish Arts Council to gaps that might be filled and to translators and publishers that might be financially supported. So under the chairmanship of Peter Franz, Professor of French at Edinburgh University and a distinguished translator himself, a steering committee was formed with members from the Scottish Arts Council, the academic and library worlds, and practicing writers and translators. They successfully applied funding from the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland and from the British Academy to employ a researcher on a modest initial project charting translations of works by 20th century authors published since 1975, which is where I came in. I began work as BOSLIT researcher in November 1994, based in the National Library of Scotland, where I previously held a number of cataloguing posts. Although my academic background was in Romance languages, I had a long-standing personal love of Scottish writing, and a postgraduate degree in Italian literature had awakened an interest in translation and reception studies. Now, although housed in the NLS, I reported to the external steering committee and worked particularly closely with Peter Franz, who was very much the prime mover behind the project in its early years, and on a day-to-day basis with Dennis Smith, who maintained the NLS's Bibliography of Scotland, a database that provided the structural model for BOSLIT. Now, how did we? Our first task, obviously, with the bibliography was to draw up a search list of Scottish authors. Now, helpfully, Dennis Smith maintained a comprehensive list of Scottish writers of all types for the Bibliography of Scotland. We went through Dennis's list, identifying in the first instance 380 literary authors writing in English, Scots, or Gaelic. It's perhaps a bit optimistic. We only found translations of 266 of those in the end, about 2/3 of them. So literature we defined in a fairly old school 20th century fashion, privileging writers of poetry, drama and literary fiction. We did, though, include a selection of children's writers and of writers of genre fiction, particularly crime, thrillers and science fiction. Our search list also included a small number of non-fiction writers like anthropologist James George Fraser, educationalist A.S. Neal, and the anti-psychiatrist R.D. Lane, all writers who reached a wide international audience, as public intellectuals and exerted an important influence on the literary scene. So when drawing up our search list, we also adopted the Bibliography of Scotland's definition of Scottishness. We're very broadly speaking, Scottish birth outweighed Scottish residence. In retrospect, though, we may have been excessively wary of including writers long resident in Scotland but born or educated elsewhere, a position that was later reversed. For purely practical reasons, we initially excluded Arthur Conan Doyle, almost obviously the Sherlock Holmes fame, almost certainly Scotland's most translated author, as we feared that too much project time would be taken up on an author who might be seen as tangential to the mainstream of Scottish writing. In retrospect, and we realised that I would end up cataloguing 1,600 translations of the thrillers of Alistair MacLean and nearly 300 of James Herriot's Tales of a Yorkshire Vet, we might have taken a different tack. Once we'd drawn up our search list, how did we start looking for translations? Well, for book-length translations, we initially relied on the following sources. Firstly, UNESCO's Index Translationum, an annual roundup of translations published in the United Nations member states. Very useful, but far from comprehensive. Go back to here. The annual national bibliography, we also drew on the annual national bibliographies published by many of Europe's national libraries and lists of books in print maintained by national booksellers or library associations. Now, when I began work, these were all still published as annual hard copy volumes, to which happily the National Library of Scotland subscribed. So the first few thousand records on the database were then largely a result of trawling methodically, search list in hand, through piles of printed volumes. As the 1990s drew on, though, these publications were increasingly issued in electronic form or were replaced by constantly updated online databases. By then, I was also able to access online National Library catalogues or National Union catalogues, although in these relatively early days of the internet, coverage obviously often didn't extend beyond fairly recent acquisitions. You found back in the 1990s, really, if you went into an online library catalogue, but generally only had what had been acquired since the library, since the catalogue had gone electronic. So essentially, you didn't find much published before the late 1980s. Then in the first decade of this century, you see massive retroconversion projects to convert the old print, card and microfiche catalogues to electronic form. Anyway, so besides book-length translations, we also tried to record poems, short stories and essays that appeared in foreign periodicals or anthologies. Some smaller countries covered this kind of material in their national bibliographies. Slovakia springs to mind. But in most cases, we relied on contacting individual authors, translators, literary agents, publishers and academics. As email was very much in its infancy, as email was very much in its infancy, this generally meant communicating by surface mail. Given how easy it is now to contact address, I'm distracted because my stopwatch has lost sight of it. Yes, there it is. Sorry, as email was very much in its infancy, this generally meant communicating by surface mail. Given how easy it is now to find contact addresses online, strange to think how much project time was spent hunting down individual mail addresses, a process which often involved sending multiple letters. So you'd write to someone saying, do you have an email? Do you have a land address for so-and-so? And they'd write back and say, no, but you could try writing to so-and-so. You know, we took ages doing this. Now, around 25% of the 22,000 translations recorded during my stint at BOSLIT were found via personal communications in this way. I also made a number of research trips to libraries and to academic centres of Scottish studies in Catalonia, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Hungary and Italy. where above hunted down translations in publications inaccessible in Scotland and helped build up a network of BOSLIT supporting scholars and translators. Individual contacts were also the main means of tracing monograph-led translations in countries with no readily accessible national bibliography or national library catalogue. We studied in general to locate reliable sources for non-European translations. In some cases, I think we may have assumed that we were missing more translations than was really the case. Subsequent research has suggested that in many areas, particularly Commonwealth countries and much of sub-Saharan Africa, it remained the norm to read English language literature in the original rather than translation. Similarly, we perhaps underestimated the extent to which a single translation brought out by a multinational publishing house might serve the entire French, Spanish, or Arabic-speaking world. Nonetheless, there were clearly large swathes of the globe, particularly Southeast Asia, particularly China and Taiwan, in fact, that were underrepresented in BOSLIT's early years. And even where we could access local libraries in those areas, it was often, as you might imagine, difficult to interpret records. Once identified, translations were entered on an online database. Now, looking back, this was an exciting and fast-moving period to be involved in library work, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction in terms. Now, the May-June 1995 issue of the professional journal Scottish Libraries featured the BOSLIT database as an example of how, quote, the internet is becoming a very tangible part of library life. And it gently mocked the skepticism of those who, quote, can't see how a bunch of computers talking to one another is going to alter their life one iota. I vividly recall a colleague looking over my shoulder at this period and exclaiming, oh, so that's the internet. So without getting too technical, BOSLIT records were catalogued using the MARC, that's machine-readable cataloging, data format, or Library of Congress subject headings, with some local variants that had previously been established for the bibliography of Scotland. At that point, the Library of Congress had no subject headings for literature in Scots, so the bibliography of Scotland had devised its own. So essentially, I was creating records which would the record for a translation would record the language, the original title, the translated title, place and date of publication, translator's name, and genre heading. And those can be quite precise. So you'd have something like Scottish fiction, 20th century, translations into French would be a good typical example. Now, while researching this article, researching this talk even, I found the accompanying photograph of myself working on the database in 1995. And so in retrospect, the fact that I'm wearing a jacket and tie is as much a period piece as a giant desk computer. So as mentioned above, the project's initial scope was restricted to listing post-1975 translations of 20th century Scottish writing. Over the next 5 years, further funding allowed us to extend our coverage to include translations published throughout the whole 20th century to cover a small group of classic pre-20th century Scottish writers. Now, this isn't the place for an in-depth analysis of the data gathered in the first phase of BOSLIT. Suffice to say, though, it provides an often challenging image of how Scottish writing was perceived abroad, with the writers who do gain international recognition sometimes as surprising as those who don't. Here, I'd only like to highlight some of our most striking discoveries. I think the greatest revelation in retrospect was the writers most closely associated with the interwar Scottish literary renaissance, a movement that's seen as absolutely key in revitalising Scottish writing and in re-establishing it, as a distinct entity, but very little contemporary publishing interest abroad. Only 5 poems by Hugh MacDiarmid, the movement's leading voice, were translated before 1945, and none by William Souter or Edwin Muir. As the novels, there are 4 translations of Neil M. Gunn, one apiece of Lewis Grassic Gibbon and Naomi Mitchison, and none of Catherine Carswell, Nan Shepherd, or William Muir. Eric Linklater and Compton Mackenzie found some success with the later part of their production, particularly in Scandinavia, but were not seen as part of a wider, distinctively Scottish literary movement. It's not that Scottish fiction was entirely ignored. John Buchan's thrillers were widely translated, and more middlebrow writers, if you like Bruce Marshall on the left here, and A.J. Cronin were international publishing phenomena from the 1930s onwards. Nor was there a recuperation of the Renaissance in the post-war period. While Hugh MacDiarmid found translations in communist Europe, his Renaissance contemporaries remained largely untranslated. In the post-war period, Muriel Spark is by far the most translated Scottish literary novelist, with otherwise very little literary fiction being translated before the emergence of William Boyd, Ian Banks, and Alistair Gray in the 1980s. Again, though, many writers of genre fiction, such as Alistair MacLean already mentioned, and here Helen McInnes, Michael Innes, and Josephine Taylor, writers of detective fiction or thrillers, were very widely translated. Unquestionably then, BOSLIT highlighted significant disparity between the 20th century Scottish literary canon as seen at home and the translated canon. I won't attempt to account here for the non-translation of the Renaissance and indeed much of the 20th century Scottish canon. Happy to discuss that later. Clearly, the lack of a significant institutional backing for Scottish writing for much of the 20th century is a significant factor. Certainly, the establishment of Scottish literature as an academic discipline from the 60s onwards, and the formation of the Scottish Arts Council triggered a substantial increase in the translation of Scottish literature with a capital L from the mid-70s onwards. In particular, there were numerous translation anthologies of Scottish verse and special issues of foreign literary periodicals devoted to contemporary Scottish poetry. Now, this especially benefited poets of a generation of Norman MacKay, Josh Mackay-Brown, Ian Crichton-Smith, and Edwin Morgan. Novelists and dramatists remained under-translated, though, throughout the 70s and 80s, and it's questionable whether the recognition of a distinctly Scottish poetic tradition extended to a perception of a broader Scottish literary tradition, or of a revival which embraced multiple genre and multiple language traditions. All this, though, was about to change. The BOSLIT project was, in fact, launched at a particularly auspicious moment for Scottish literature. The success of Irving Welsh's 1993 novel, Trainspotting, awoke an interest in Scottish writing unparalleled since the 1820s, when many Scottish writers were translated into wake of Sir Walter Scott. The late 90s and early 2000s saw translations of novelists like Ali Smith, A.O. Kennedy, Laura Hurd, Alan Warner, and Andrew O'Hagan, James Meek, and Andrew Crummy. There was also a belated international discovery of writers who had emerged in the 70s and 80s, like Alistair Gray, James Kelman, and William McIlvanney. Shortly afterwards, successful translations of Ian Rankin and Val McDermid led to the international discovery of Tartan Noir, with foreign publishers turning their attention to Louise Welsh. Louise Welsh is The Cutting Room, I think, actually seems to be the most translated Scottish novel of the 21st century so far, and Dennis Mina, and the rather less noirish crime fiction of Alexander McCall Smith. There was also a substantial uptick in interest in Scottish poetry. Anthologies of Scottish verse have appeared in Austria, Belgium, Brazil, China, Croatia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Hungary, Iran, and Italy. And a growing number of volumes were devoted to individual Scottish poets, including John Burnside, Kate Clancy, Robert Crawford, Christine DeLuca, Carol Ann Duffy, Kathleen Jamie, Jackie Kay, Don Patterson, and Robin Robertson. For the first time in almost 2 centuries, Scottish writing was not only being widely translated, but widely perceived as distinctly Scottish. This was a phenomenon, though, that was only just beginning when I left the project at the end of 1999. It was not so much the print publication of Trainspotting in 1993 as its film adaptation in 1996. Sort of blurred image there, isn't it? But triggered the explosion of interest in Scottish writing. Now, with the completion of coverage for the 20th century in 1999, funding for the editorial post, my job, expired, and an application to the Heritage Lottery Fund for further funding was unexpectedly rejected. Now, I left to take up another post at that point, but funding was eventually provided by the Arts and Humanities Research Board for a 4-year project from 2000 to 2004 to record pre-20th century translations. At this point, Tom Hubbard was appointed to my former post, and Professor Ronnie Jack of Edinburgh University took over from the retiring Peter Franz as chair of the steering committee. This new grant didn't permit research into more recent translations, but the NLS, National Library of Scotland, now had a dedicated budget to acquire translations of Scottish writers, and it fed its bibliographical information back into BOSLIT. By the completion of the pre-20th century project in 2004, the database contained over 20,000 records of translations into 104 different languages. At which point, BOSLIT found itself in a double bind. On one hand, neither the NLS nor the Scottish Arts Council felt able to commit themselves to the long-term support of BOSLIT. On the other, BOSLIT was no longer such an attractive prospect to other funding bodies, as it essentially needed support to update and fill gaps in existing findings rather than pursue a discrete new project. Essentially, it was saying, funding bodies were going to be saying, but you've already had money to research translations of the 20th century and now in the pre-20th century period. And yeah, obviously, it was impossible to do that in a complete way in the time involved, but it was very difficult to explain why what was being asked for hadn't already been done, essentially. The situation was exacerbated by the financial crash of 2008 and the ensuing years of austerity. As a result, paid work on the database ceased in 2004, but over the next 15 years, a further 8,000 records were entered by volunteers, particularly the now retired Dennis Smith and Anne Matheson, former keeper of printed books at the NLS and a very active member of the BOSLIT steering committee. Yet, despite all these efforts, BOSLIT's online presence was in jeopardy. In 2018, the National Library of Scotland adopted a new library management system which no longer supported BOSLIT's 20-year-old format. The raw data set was moved offline, though it remained downloadable free of charge from the library's data foundry. In 2021, the University of Glasgow, supported by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, launched a project to reboot the database and create a new network of scholars, translators and publishers to secure its future. This project, led by Professors Kirsty McHugh and Lorna Hughes, had three aims: to provide the bibliography with a new digital home using the open source Omeka platform, allowing for enhanced analysis of BOSLIT's data. Two, to develop a plan to secure BOSLIT's long-term digital future, learning from existing national bibliographical database projects. So note that the network hoped to establish BOSLIT as a case study for rescuing and developing similar bibliographical resources at risk in a rapidly changing digital world. And finally, it hoped to raise awareness about BOSLIT amongst both professionals and the wider public as a tool for understanding and analysing the impact of Scottish writing on the modern imagination. A website, was created which tracked the new project process and which featured blog posts tracing the history of BOSLIT and showcasing the international reception of individual Scottish writers like George Mackay-Brown, James Hogg, Muriel Spark and Walter Scott. Eventually, on the 3rd of November 2023, the new database was publicly launched online, available directly from the project's website. This is the new BOSLIT, the homepage of a new BOSLIT website. The database permits searches by author, translator, original language and language for translation, by date and place of publication, and by genre. This is what you see if you enter the BOSLIT database on the new website. And if you were to search for a translation via those various searches I described, what you would see is something like this record here, which a record for the French translation of Muriel Spark's novel, A Far Cry from Kensington. So you see at the top the translated title, the author's name, the original title, the translator, publisher, publication date, country publication, language of publication, and the genre of the subject, Scottish fiction. Now, the Glasgow University team is currently pursuing further funding to bring BOSLIT data fully up to the present moment and to fill in known gaps in the existing data. We also plan a book of essays to capture the history of BOSLIT and highlight its importance as a resource. Personally, I feel it's just to finish, it's particularly vital to secure funding to research translations published over the last 2 decades. BOSLIT currently has very strong data for contemporary Scottish writing until around 2008, but barely covers the following years. Further research is thus needed to reveal whether the renewed international interest I described in Scottish writing at the turn of the century was a short-lived or a lasting phenomenon with a durable impact on international perceptions of Scottish writing that would also permit researchers to compare the reception of the interwar Renaissance and the 1990s generation to see whether the latter's international success tells us anything about the former's substantial failure to reach a global audience. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul.
I'll stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both very much for those really interesting, really fascinating talks. We have very little time, but if you can all bear with us for a few minutes, we've got a few minutes for questions or reactions. While people are gathering their thoughts, just one thing that maybe I can say to both of you. John, you started your talk by saying that you wanted to look at the way into translation into Scottish literature, and the way that you put it, I think is very interesting. You translate into literature rather than translating into a language, and then so maybe that a comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's part of the conundrum of Scottish literature, especially Scottish literature in English. To put it in a very simple way, is where do you put the books in the bookshop? If you've got William Boyd, for example, or Muriel Spark, do you put them under Scottish or do you put them in fiction? And it's the same kind of problem, I think. I was very interested I'm always interested in what Paul's saying, but also it kind of impacts upon who goes into the database. There are various reasons for not putting Arthur Conan Doyle into the database, and I was around while those discussions were going on.
Yeah.
And I think if Arthur Conan Doyle had written in Scots, he would be in the database. But because he's actually a universal author in many ways, and he's not perceived necessarily as Scottish, and of course there are just too many translations. He's massively important. He changes the nature of the Chinese detective novel. Before Sherlock Holmes, Chinese detectives solved problems by torture and magic. After Sherlock Holmes, Chinese detective novels, the detectives use the magistrate novels, Judge Dee, the magistrates use their little grey cells, their minds. They use ratiocination. So you can actually see, and this has been shown empirically to be the case, that there's a shift in the way that people tell stories because of the impact of Conan Doyle. But is Conan Doyle Scottish? Or is he part of Scottish literature? Now people will say, yes, he is. The ground keeps changing. When I was an undergraduate 50 years ago, the idea that Byron might be considered a Scottish poet was just fantasy. But now it's taken for granted. So these things change. I also think when you think about it, it's not very surprising that A.J. Cronin has many more translations than, let's say, Lewis Grassic Gibbon, for example. Lewis Grassic Gibbon might be Scotland's favourite novelist, but A.J. Cronin had also tremendous success in the English-speaking world and internationally. And if you're looking at things like book contracts, agents, publishers, guaranteed sales, then you're going to bet on Cronin. Cronin is also going to proto-socialist. So he's very big in the Soviet Union when I was there, when I used to live there. And he's big again in China for the same reason. So but once you start looking at it, for me, I'll stop talking now, but for me, the really interesting thing about getting involved in BOSLIT and getting involved in translation was that it changes the landscape. It changes the way that you think about your own literature when you start seeing it through the eyes of other people, through the eyes of the guys here, all except Alan Ryuk at the bottom. Alan's got a question.
We always intended to go back and we always intended to go back and recuperate Arthur Conan Doyle, but it's basically the problem was you had to sort of propose a discrete project, and to which the answer was, "Why haven't you done that already?" So that we created an insoluble problem for ourselves with that. Yes. Sorry. Go on, Alan. Yes.
Alan.
Yeah, it was just the question that arises is how accommodating we are in terms of what Scottish literature is, or however it might be not defined, but described.
And how accommodating you have become.
Well, it's at certain points in the past have been.
Yeah.
So that there are various strategies involved in particular translations, as John pointed out specifically, with reference to Gavin Douglas doing what he did at the time that he did it with particular intentions in mind, as well as simply producing a fantastic translation of Virgil. So there's the intentionality of the author in making the translations, but there's also the intentionality of the readers and critics and literary historians who are building this into a story over a whole trajectory of the establishment of a Scottish literary critical tradition, and therefore a Scottish literary history. So the question perhaps is, for me, not so much, are these people Scottish, or is Conan Doyle Scottish? Well, Conan Doyle is Irish by descent, Scottish by birth, and British by decision, by his own choice, as it were. And you can easily identify those aspects of his life and work. But the real thing I wanted just to mention here also, to put a spanner in the works a wee bit, is a course that I was on when I was an undergraduate hundreds of years ago at the University of Cambridge. And the course was entitled The English Moralists. And the three writers who were on this course that we studied for the entire course were Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx. Now, outrageous, we might say. These guys are not English. They're not, call them moralists. Well, there was morality as a question. But I thought it was terrific. It was a terrific course, and it introduced me to these writers in various ways, which investigated their philosophies and their studies and their moralities. But they had undeniably huge influence and huge effect on writers of all kinds, poets, novelists, dramatists, in the English language, subsequent to their own writing and the translations of their own writing. So to call them the English moralists, just say they're part of our story too, seemed to me accommodating and challenging in ways that we could actually learn from in the further evolution of Scottish literature, of which BOSLIT seems to be a fantastically important part. Thanks.
Can I come back to that? Yeah, just to agree with that. The point that I'm trying to make is the boundaries are porous. And one of the things that BOSLIT does is it identifies some of the pores. And so you can actually use it as a way of changing the criteria for inclusion. And you do it in ways that you hadn't thought about before, if you're me. Leila Abilela, born in the Sudan, moves to Aberdeen, writes a novel called The Translator, and is adopted as part of the canon of Scottish literature. So
although she identifies as a Muslim and not as a Scottish person.
Yes.
She's on BOSLIT.
She's in BOSLIT, so despite what she's saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And she will be in BOSLIT. So you've got so you have these adopted, and it's interesting that she self-defines not in terms of national identity. So you'd put her in the fiction part of the bookshop, but not the Muslim part, because that one in Scotland doesn't exist. But I don't know if in Scotland there is the Scottish part of the bookshop, and then there is other fiction, and it's always a problem. Where do you find people?
Well, you don't get that. Obviously, you don't get that abroad, do you? I mean, you get foreign literature.
Yeah.
You know.
We're definitely.
Corey, you disappeared from my screen, but I think you wanted to say something. Corey? I think he's gone.
For Gina, I have a Scott note on Cyrano de Bergerac. if you want to read that as an introduction to it, please. I don't get any money from it. ESL does.
Can I just, because we're running out of time, I'm sorry, can I just ask one quick question? Okay. In fact, it's a follow-up question on what Alan was saying to Paul. I was interested in, when you said at the beginning you had to meet up and decide what the criteria was of Scottish literature, and that you favoured the people who were born in Scotland over people, for example, who were living in Scotland. And I was interested to know, in your stint as, working with BOSLIT, did you have to to meet up again and change this definition of what you would consider, and how did that work? How did you, because it's interesting to have an insider's view.
Yeah, it was particularly happening actually shortly after I left. For example, the criteria were extended to include the work of J.K. Rowling, which I would might have been a decision we regret, to be honest. However, I wasn't there, but exactly, somebody but it made sense. I mean, even people who are actually quite closely associated with the literary Renaissance, like Eric Linklater, I think was born anywhere near Scotland. Sidney Goodser Smith. So it was
New Zealand.
Yeah, it was really taken on a case by case basis, and there was a lot of argument. I mean, for example, when I was there, Byron wasn't Scottish, and which I always thought was wrong. And then that decision was reversed in the sort of pre-20th century phase of the project. But yeah, we were discussing and revising these things all the time. I remember sort of thinking,
but it was more on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think we did work in conjunction with the Bibliography of Scotland, which spends a lot of time deciding who and who isn't Scottish. Funnily enough, I felt a little uncomfortable deciding who and isn't Scottish, not being I've lived in Scotland since I was 6, but audibly not
an incomer.
Yeah.
I can see like a blow-in. I mean, it's as if you can claim J.K. Rowling whether she likes it or not.
Yeah.
If you want.
I think, but an interesting technical issue which has come up with the Chinese material in BOSLIT is how is it spelled? How is it represented? The same will go for Arabic. How do you search these things? And these are technical issues that BOSLIT, I know, is working on and still has to solve. Because even in English, there will be variations in the way that the Chinese characters will be represented in Western script, which makes it difficult to access. I don't know how to spell even the name of the poet. Is it Li Po? Is it Li Bai? We've been talking about that. But certainly for China, BOSLIT is still very underrepresentative. And it's always fascinating to me what is being translated. There are 2 Chinese language versions of Trainspotting, again, as you rightly say, propelled by the success of the film. But one is a mainland Chinese translation. And how the hell do you translate Trainspotting into Chinese under the current regime and in Taiwanese? And the Taiwanese and the Chinese, mainland Chinese translations are different in this case. It's different translators. And in a way, translation creates a space where you can talk about things that are otherwise not talkable about in China, like drug abuse in urban situations. It doesn't tell a positive story.
But it's okay
because it's foreign.
That it should be translated and included into, the books that can be read in China.
Yeah, and it's translated partly using Beijing dialect as well, so it's an urban dialect. So it's an interesting one. But it creates a space where things can be talked about in China that cannot be talked about currently in the national literature.
Look, I'd like to carry on this conversation, which I find really, really interesting, but I think our time is up now. So the only thing I need to do now is to thank John and Paul again very much for this very, very interesting, those very, very interesting presentations. There's a lot to take away from your presentations. There's a recording of it, so if anyone wants to go, I certainly will want to go back to them. They'll be available shortly. So thank you, John. Thank you, Paul. Thank you everyone for coming and for attending. It's been a pleasure as usual, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye from Brazil.
Yeah.